I'm Sarah Tanaka, 52, and I just brought down a Y6 billion tech corporation in Tokyo with nothing but a laptop and 30 years of insider knowledge they foolishly left intact. Last Tuesday, my 25-year-old department chief called me into his sterile office on the 40th floor of our Shibuya tower and handed me a restructuring notice, effective immediately, claiming company modernization, while I watched through the window as they celebrated securing the biggest government contract in company history, using the revolutionary blockchain framework I'd spent 2 years perfecting in secret. As security escorted me past the bowing receptionists with my personal items in a small box, they had no idea I'd already embedded a failsafe deep in the system's core, one that would activate exactly 72 hours after my access was revoked. What happened next taught Nippon DataTech Corporation that loyalty and respect work both ways, and when you discard a senior engineer like yesterday's newspaper, the consequences can destroy everything you've built. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to where it all began. April 1994, I was 22 years old, fresh out of Tokyo University with a computer science degree and stars in my eyes. The original employment contract I signed that day, yellowed now with age, promised something that seems almost quaint in today's corporate world: lifetime employment with Nippon DataTech Corporation. The company wasn't much to look at then, just a small office squeezed between electronics shops in Akihabara, but founder Kenji Matsumoto had a vision that captivated me completely. The early days were magical in their simplicity. We were a team of 12 passionate engineers working 16-hour days, not because we had to, but because we believed we were building something revolutionary. Matsumoto-san would bring us bento boxes at midnight and share his dreams of creating technology that would modernize Japan's government infrastructure. Technology should serve the people, Tanaka-san, he would tell me, his weathered hands drawing diagrams on whiteboards. And the people who create that technology should be honored for their dedication. Those weren't just words to him. When Japan's economy stumbled in the late 90s, bigger companies were laying off workers by the thousands, but Matsumoto-san took pay cuts to keep every single one of us employed. He saw us as family, not resources to be optimized. I remember working Christmas Eve 1998, debugging code for a municipal water system, when he appeared with hot coffee and sat beside me. "Your dedication will be remembered, Sarah-chan," he said, using the affectionate suffix that made me feel truly valued. "This company succeeds because of people like you." I threw myself into every project with religious devotion. Database architecture, network security, system integration, I mastered them all. By 2000, I was lead systems architect, responsible for the backbone infrastructure that supported everything the company did. Every server, every protocol, every security measure passed through my hands. I didn't just build systems, I lived and breathed them. Weekends meant nothing when there was code to optimize or vulnerabilities to patch. The tech boom years were intoxicating. We moved from that cramped Akihabara office to a sleek building in Shibuya, expanded our team to over 200 employees, and landed contracts with major corporations and government agencies. I was promoted to senior systems architect, then to deputy chief of technology. My salary grew from Y2.8 million to Y12 million annually. But more importantly, I felt respected, valued, essential. Matsumoto-san would walk the floors every morning, greeting each employee by name, asking about their families. "A company is only as strong as the loyalty it inspires," he would say during our monthly all-hands meetings. I believed him completely. When headhunters called offering double my salary at Sony or NTT, I politely declined. This was my company. These were my systems. This was my family. Looking back now, I realize I was building my own prison, embedding myself so deeply into Nippon DataTech's infrastructure that leaving would have felt like abandoning my own children. Every system bore my digital fingerprints. Every security protocol reflected my methodical approach to protecting what I considered sacred. I wasn't just an employee. I was the guardian of everything the company had built. That original contract, with its promise of lifetime employment, became my article of faith. In a world of disposable workers and corporate reshuffling, I had found my home. Everything changed the winter Matsumoto-san died. Heart attack at his desk, they said, working late on a proposal that would have secured our largest government contract. Yet, I found him there the next morning, slumped over blueprints for a digital infrastructure project that would have revolutionized how Japanese citizens accessed public services. His final act was trying to build something meaningful for the country he loved. The funeral was everything Matsumoto-san would have wanted: dignified, respectful, filled with employees who genuinely mourned a mentor and father figure. But even as we bowed before his portrait, I sensed the tremors beginning. His son, Takeshi, had returned from his MBA program at Wharton, with ideas that felt foreign to everything we'd built. During the wake, I overheard him telling investors about maximizing shareholder value and eliminating operational inefficiencies. At the company memorial service, Takeshi delivered what should have been a tribute to his father's vision. Instead, it became a manifesto for transformation. He had framed his father's retirement speech, the one where Matsumoto-san had promised to always honor the company's founding values of loyalty, respect, and technological excellence. Takeshi pointed to that frame as he spoke about evolving beyond outdated paradigms and embracing global best practices. "My father built this company on relationships," Takeshi announced to our assembled staff, his suit sharper and more expensive than anything Matsumoto-san had ever worn. "Now we must build it on results. The marketplace doesn't reward sentiment. It rewards efficiency. We will honor his legacy by becoming the most competitive technology firm in Japan." The changes began immediately. Takeshi hired McKinsey consultants, who prowled our floors with clipboards and calculating eyes, timing how long employees spent in meetings, measuring productivity metrics that had never mattered when we were a family. The warm morning greetings disappeared, replaced by sterile efficiency reports and quarterly performance reviews that reduced 30 years of dedication to color-coded spreadsheets. The first layoffs came 6 months after the funeral. Right-sizing. The organization, they called it. Yamada-san from accounting, who had processed my very first paycheck. Sato-san from maintenance, who knew every wire and circuit in our building. 23 people, with over 400 years of combined experience, walked out by security with the same cardboard boxes I would carry 3 years later. I watched from my office window as each of them bowed one final time to the building. That had been their second home. Yamada-san looked up at my floor, and I swear I could see the confusion in his eyes. How had loyalty become a liability? The survivors adapted with typical Japanese resilience, working harder to prove their indispensability. But the family atmosphere Matsumoto-san had cultivated was gone, replaced by the careful politeness of people who no longer trusted their environment. Conversations stopped when managers appeared. Laughter became rare. The communal spirit that had carried us through lean years evaporated like morning mist. Takeshi hired his friends from business school, young men in expensive suits who spoke of digital transformation and agile methodologies, without understanding the foundation systems that made such transformations possible. They looked at veterans like me with barely concealed impatience, as if our experience was a burden rather than an asset. Still, I believed my work spoke for itself. The systems I'd built were flawless, the security protocols unbreachable, the infrastructure scalable and robust. Surely competence would protect me where sentiment had failed others. I doubled down on my commitment, working even longer hours, perfecting every detail, making myself indispensable. How naive I was to think that indispensability was still valued in this new world they were building. By 2022, the government was talking seriously about blockchain integration for public services, a massive digital transformation that would touch every aspect of Japanese civic life. I saw the opportunity immediately, and knew I had the expertise to make it happen. What I created over the next 2 years would become both my masterpiece and my weapon. The blockchain framework documentation, 847 pages of technical specifications, security protocols, and implementation guidelines, represented every evening and weekend I sacrificed for the company. While my colleagues went home to their families, I stayed late in the empty office, surrounded by whiteboards covered in algorithmic diagrams and network architectures that existed nowhere else in the world. The challenge was immense. Create a blockchain system secure enough for government data, scalable enough for Japan's 125 million citizens, and efficient enough to handle millions of daily transactions. Traditional blockchain solutions were too slow, too energy-intensive, or too vulnerable for such critical infrastructure. I needed something revolutionary. I started with quantum-resistant cryptography, anticipating threats that wouldn't emerge for another decade. The encryption algorithms I developed were based on mathematical problems so complex that even quantum computers would need centuries to crack them. Each block in my chain contained not just transaction data, but also integrity verification protocols that made tampering virtually impossible. The genius was in the distributed consensus mechanism. Instead of energy-intensive mining, I created a hybrid proof-of-stake system that leveraged the existing government infrastructure. Municipal servers across Japan would participate in transaction validation, creating a network so distributed that no single entity could compromise it. The beauty was breathtaking. A digital nervous system connecting every prefecture, every city hall, every government office in an unbreakable web of trust. But I wasn't naive about corporate politics. As I built this system, I embedded what I told myself were administrative access protocols and emergency override functions. Every experienced systems architect includes backdoors for maintenance and crisis management. I rationalized. These weren't weapons. They were tools for responsible stewardship. The failsafe sequences I coded were elegant in their subtlety, triggered by specific conditions, like the revocation of my system access. They would initiate cascading verification errors that would make the entire framework unstable. Not destructive, I told myself, just protective. A way to ensure responsible transition if I ever left the company. Working nights alone in the office, I felt like a digital artisan crafting something eternal. The code was poetry, each function and module flowing naturally into the next. I documented everything meticulously, creating tutorials and maintenance guides that read like love letters to the technology. This wasn't just software. It was my intellectual legacy. The breakthrough came on a rain-soaked Thursday night in November 2023. I had been struggling with transaction throughput. The system could handle security and distribution, but speed remained elusive. Staring at my code at 2 a.m., exhausted and caffeinated beyond reason, I saw the solution. Instead of processing transactions sequentially, I could bundle them into smart contracts that executed in parallel streams, each validated by different network nodes simultaneously. I coded for 18 straight hours, forgetting to eat, forgetting to sleep, forgetting everything except the elegant solution unfolding on my screens. When I finally tested the complete system, it processed 50,000 transactions per second while maintaining quantum-level security. It was everything the government needed and more. A framework that could handle not just current requirements, but decades of future growth. The documentation I compiled was comprehensive enough to guide implementation across the entire Japanese government infrastructure. Database schemas, API specifications, security protocols, maintenance procedures, everything needed to transform how citizens interacted with their government. I had created a digital revolution, and I was proud beyond words. When I finally presented the completed framework to Takeshi and the management team, their response was lukewarm. "Interesting work, Tanaka-san," Takeshi said, barely glancing at the 847-page document that represented 2 years of my life. "We'll have our consultants review it for commercial viability." Consultants, to evaluate work that they couldn't hope to understand, much less improve. But I remained optimistic. Quality speaks for itself, I believed. When the government saw what I had created, recognition would follow. My framework would win the contract, save the company, and finally prove the value of experience over ambition. I had no idea I was handing them the rope they would use to hang me. The business card was pristine white with raised lettering that caught the light. Hiroshi Yamamoto, Chief Technology Officer, Harvard MBA. At 25, he was younger than some of the code I had written. Yet Takeshi presented him as the future of our technology division. The nephew of a major investor, Hiroshi had spent 2 years at a Silicon Valley startup that had burned through $2 billion before collapsing, but somehow this qualified him to oversee systems he couldn't begin to comprehend. Our first meeting was a masterclass in generational disconnect. Hiroshi sat behind a glass desk in his corner office, his Harvard diploma prominently displayed beside photos of himself with various tech celebrities I didn't recognize. He wore the uniform of his generation, designer jeans, limited edition, sneakers, and a confidence that seemed inversely proportional to his actual experience. "Tanaka-san," he began, not bothering with the respectful honorifics that had once defined our workplace culture. "I've reviewed your work history. Very traditional, very Japanese, but we're moving toward global best practices now. Agile development, cloud-native architecture, AI-first solutions. The old ways of doing things are holding us back." I tried to bridge the gap diplomatically. "Yamamoto-san, I appreciate fresh perspectives. Perhaps we could discuss how my blockchain framework aligns with your vision. The government contract requires the blockchain thing? He waved dismissively. That's exactly what I mean. Blockchain is so 2021. We need to be thinking about Web3, about NFTs, about the metaverse integration. The government doesn't know what it wants. Our job is to show them what's possible. It was like explaining symphony composition to someone who only recognized 3-chord pop songs. The framework I had created was architecturally sophisticated, addressing problems he couldn't even identify, much less solve. But in his mind, anything that predated his arrival was automatically obsolete. I'd like to propose a complete technological refresh, Hiroshi continued, pulling out a sleek tablet to show me his presentation. We'll migrate everything to microservices, implement DevOps pipelines, and leverage machine learning for predictive governance. The old monolithic systems need to go. The old monolithic systems he was dismissing were the backbone of everything we did. Stable, secure, battle-tested infrastructure that had processed billions of yen in government contracts without a single security breach. But stability wasn't sexy enough for his PowerPoint slides. Over the following weeks, Hiroshi implemented what he called digital transformation initiatives. Daily stand-up meetings where productivity was measured in story points rather than actual results. Slack channels that buzzed constantly with emoji reactions and animated GIFs instead of substantive technical discussions. A transition from careful, documented development to move fast and break things philosophy that made my engineer's soul cringe. I tried to adapt. Really, I did. I learned the new terminology, attended the workshops on design thinking and customer journey mapping, even attempted to provide feedback in the collaborative tools that replaced actual face-to-face communication. But it was clear that my 30 years of experience were seen as baggage rather than assets. The breaking point came during a technical review of the blockchain framework. Hiroshi had assembled a team of external consultants, fresh-faced graduates from coding boot camps, who spoke fluently about disruption, but couldn't debug a memory leak if their lives depended on it. They spent 3 hours dissecting my work, suggesting improvements that would have introduced vulnerabilities a first-year computer science student could exploit. The architecture is too complex, announced one consultant who looked barely old enough to drink. We need to simplify the consensus mechanism. Maybe use a more mainstream protocol like Ethereum. I watched in horror as they proposed changes that would have gutted the security features that made the framework suitable for government use. Their suggestions weren't improvements. They were a demonstration of fundamental misunderstanding. But Hiroshi nodded along enthusiastically, treating their ignorance as innovation. This is exactly the kind of fresh thinking we need, he declared. Tanaka-san, I want you to work with this team to modernize your approach. Less documentation, more iteration. We need to ship fast and optimize later. Ship fast and optimize later. With government infrastructure. With systems that would handle the personal data of every Japanese citizen. The casual disregard for security. Protocols that had taken me decades to perfect was breathtaking in its recklessness. That night, I sat in my small apartment staring at the business card Hiroshi had given me during our first meeting. The raised lettering seemed to mock everything I had spent my career building. This was the person who would determine the future of my life's work. Who would decide whether 3 decades of dedication had any value in his brave new world? I began to understand that this wasn't about technology at all. It was about erasure. The systematic elimination of institutional memory in favor of whatever was fashionable that quarter. People like me weren't just redundant. We were obstacles to the kind of transformation that looked good in investor presentations, but collapsed under real-world pressure. The question wasn't whether I would survive this changing of the guard. The question was how much damage they would do with my life's work before they finally discarded me. The McKinsey consultants arrived on a Monday morning like well-dressed harbingers of doom. Their report, thick, glossy, and filled with charts, that reduced human beings to data points, recommended human resource optimization, with the clinical detachment of surgeons discussing which limbs to amputate. I found a copy left carelessly on a conference room table, and what I read made my blood freeze. Legacy employees represent significant operational inefficiencies, the report stated with corporate euphemism masking brutal intent. Workers hired before 2010 demonstrate 23% lower productivity metrics and 31% higher compensation costs relative to output. Strategic workforce realignment could generate $180 million in annual savings. Legacy employees. After 30 years of service, I had become a line item in a cost-cutting spreadsheet. The signs had been accumulating like storm clouds, but I had chosen to ignore them with the willful blindness of someone whose entire identity was tied to their workplace. Meetings I had once led were now scheduled without me. Technical decisions that required my expertise were made by committees that didn't include the person who had built the systems they were discussing. Hiroshi began holding strategy sessions in conference rooms with frosted glass, their contents deliberately obscured. I would walk past and see the silhouettes of younger employees gesturing at presentations, their voices a low murmur of ambition and calculation. When these meetings ended, participants would emerge with carefully neutral expressions, avoiding eye contact with colleagues who hadn't been invited. The isolation was subtle, but systematic. My keycard access was quietly restricted. I could no longer enter server rooms I had designed, couldn't access development environments I had architected. When I questioned these limitations, IT support cited new security protocols and promised to escalate the issue, but resolution never came. My paranoia, once an asset in cybersecurity, became a survival mechanism. I began documenting every interaction, every email, every casual conversation that might be relevant later. More importantly, I started enhancing my administrative access to critical systems, telling myself it was defensive preparation rather than offensive planning. The weekend work I had always done voluntarily became my opportunity for digital insurance. While the building sat empty, I would install additional monitoring protocols, create redundant administrative accounts, and embed deeper access points throughout the infrastructure. If they planned to remove me from systems I had built, I would ensure that removal was as painful as possible. Each backdoor I created was elegant and virtually undetectable, dormant code that would activate only under specific conditions, administrative overrides buried so deep in system architecture that discovering them would require someone with my exact expertise. I convinced myself these were legitimate security measures, emergency access protocols that any responsible architect would implement. But late at night, alone in my office with the Tokyo skyline glittering beyond my window, I knew I was preparing for war. The consultants recommended performance improvement plans for employees over 50, mandatory training in emerging technologies for senior staff, and mentorship opportunities that would pair experienced workers with recent graduates. The language was carefully neutral, but the intent was clear: make the old guard so uncomfortable they would leave voluntarily. My colleagues began disappearing one by one. Voluntary early retirement packages were offered with just enough financial incentive to seem generous, but with timelines that made refusal seem almost insubordinate. Some took the offers gratefully, eager to escape an environment that no longer valued their contributions. Others clung on desperately, accepting humiliating demotions and meaningless training programs that were clearly designed to push them toward the exit. I watched Nakamura-san, a brilliant database architect with 25 years of experience, reduced to attending seminars on Introduction to Cloud Computing, taught by contractors half his age. The humiliation in his eyes was painful to witness, but he endured it because, like me, he had no identity outside this company. The writing was on the wall, illuminated in McKinsey consulting fees and Harvard MBA confidence. But I had spent 3 decades building digital fortresses, and I wasn't going to surrender without a fight. Every system they relied on bore my fingerprints. Every critical process depended on infrastructure I had designed. If they wanted to discard me like outdated hardware, they would discover that some legacy systems have very sharp edges when handled carelessly. The question wasn't whether they would eventually target me. The consultant's report had already answered that. The question was whether I would be ready when they did. The contract proposal arrived like a gift from heaven. A government tender for a nationwide digital infrastructure project worth $2.8 billion, the largest public sector technology contract in Japanese history. As I read through the technical requirements, my heart raced with recognition and excitement. Every specification, every security protocol, every performance benchmark matched perfectly with the blockchain framework I had spent 2 years developing. This was it. This was the moment my work would finally receive the recognition it deserved. The project scope was breathtaking, a unified platform for all government services, from tax filing to healthcare records, from municipal permits to national identification systems. Citizens would interact with their government through a single, secure interface that could handle everything from parking tickets to passport renewals. The technical challenges were exactly what my framework had been designed to solve. I stayed late that night in the empty office, cross-referencing every requirement with my documentation. Quantum-resistant encryption? Check. Distributed consensus. Protocols? Check. Scalability to handle 125 million users? Check. My framework wasn't just suitable for this contract. It was perfect for it, as if the tender had been written specifically with my work in mind. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with Hiroshi to discuss our proposal strategy. Surely, faced with such a perfect alignment between requirements and capability, even he would recognize the value of my framework. This was our chance to win the biggest contract in company history, to secure our future, to prove that experience and expertise still mattered in the modern world. Yamamoto-san, I began, spreading the tender documents across his glass desk. I believe we have a unique competitive advantage for this project. My blockchain framework addresses every major requirement, and I've already solved the technical challenges that will stump our competitors. Hiroshi barely glanced at the documents, his attention divided between his smartphone and our conversation. The government thing? Yes. We're definitely bidding on that. I've already discussed strategy. With the team. The team? I felt a chill of exclusion. I wasn't aware we had assembled a proposal team yet. Given that my framework is central to our technical approach, actually, we're going in a different direction. Hiroshi interrupted, finally looking up from his phone. More innovative, more disruptive. The consultants have identified some exciting opportunities to leverage AI and machine learning in ways the government hasn't even considered yet. I stared at him in disbelief. Yamamoto-san, the technical requirements are very specific. They need proven, secure infrastructure, not experimental AI applications. The framework I've developed is production-ready and tested. It's exactly what they're asking for. That's exactly the problem, he replied with the condescending patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. They think they know what they need, but we can show them what's possible. Why give them exactly what they asked for, when we can give them something revolutionary? The meeting that followed was a masterclass in modern corporate delusion. Hiroshi outlined a proposal that would ignore most of the government's actual requirements, in favor of buzzword-heavy features that sounded impressive but solved no real problems. AI-powered chatbots for services that required human verification. Machine learning algorithms for processes that demanded regulatory compliance. Blockchain technology reduced to a marketing checkbox rather than the foundational architecture it needed to be. We're not just submitting a proposal, Hiroshi declared with evangelical fervor. We're educating the market about what 21st century government can look like. I tried one more time to inject sanity into the discussion. The tender evaluation criteria prioritize security, scalability, and proven reliability. My framework scores perfectly on all these metrics. What you're proposing is impressive, but it's also unproven and potentially unstable for critical infrastructure. Tanaka-san, Hiroshi said with finality, I appreciate your dedication to traditional approaches, but this is bigger than incremental improvements. This is about transformation. I'll need you to support the team with documentation and technical specifications, but the strategic direction has already been decided. Support the team. After 30 years of leading technological initiatives, I was being relegated to documentation. Support for a strategy that ignored my expertise entirely. But what choice did I have? This contract could make or break the company's future, and despite my growing resentment, I still cared deeply about Nippon DataTech's success. Over the following weeks, I watched in horror as the proposal took shape. The team Hiroshi had assembled, mostly recent graduates with impressive resumes but limited real-world experience, created a presentation that was visually stunning and technically nonsensical. They borrowed elements from my framework, without understanding the underlying architecture, proposed solutions that couldn't possibly work at scale, and made promises that would require technologies that didn't exist yet. When they asked me to review their technical specifications, I found myself in an impossible position. I could either sabotage the proposal by pointing out its fundamental flaws, or participate in what I knew was a doomed effort that would embarrass the company and waste months of development time. I chose a middle path that satisfied no one. I provided technical corrections where absolutely necessary, but kept my deeper concerns to myself. The resulting proposal was less catastrophically flawed than the original, but still fundamentally disconnected from what the government actually needed. The day we submitted the proposal, Hiroshi organized a champagne celebration in the conference room overlooking Tokyo Bay. To innovation, he toasted, raising his glass toward the setting sun. To the future. I stood at the edge of the group, holding my untouched champagne and watching my colleagues celebrate what I was certain would be our defeat. They had taken my life's work, misunderstood it, corrupted it, and presented it as their own innovation. Win or lose, I had been erased from the narrative of my own creation. But I was wrong about one thing. We didn't lose the contract. We won it, and that victory would destroy everything I had left to lose. The restructuring notice was crisp, official, and utterly devastating. Tuesday morning, 9:47 a.m. I was summoned to Hiroshi's office where he sat behind his glass desk, with a representative from Human Resources, a woman I recognized but had never spoken to, whose presence immediately told me this wasn't a routine meeting. "Please, sit down, Tanaka-san," Hiroshi said, his voice carrying the rehearsed tone of someone who had practiced this conversation. The HR representative placed a manila folder on the desk between us, her expression professionally neutral but not unkind. "Due to organizational restructuring and our commitment to technological modernization," Hiroshi began, reading from notes, "we've made the difficult decision to eliminate several positions that no longer align with our strategic direction. Your position as senior systems architect is being discontinued, effective immediately." The words hit me like a physical blow. 30 years of service, terminated with the emotional weight of a weather report. I stared at the document they slid across the desk. Formal, legal, final. The language was bloodless corporate speak. Redundancy due to technological obsolescence. Elimination of legacy system dependencies. Strategic workforce optimization. "I don't understand," I managed to say, though of course I understood. "Perfectly. The government contract. We just won the largest project in company history. You'll need experienced systems architects to implement. That's exactly why this decision was necessary," Hiroshi interrupted, his confidence growing as he delivered what was clearly a prepared explanation. "The new contract requires modern approaches, agile methodologies, cloud-native solutions. We need team members who can adapt quickly to emerging technologies. Not people who are too invested in traditional approaches. 30 years of expertise reduced to stubborn resistance to change." The HR representative pushed a second folder toward me. "Your severance package is quite generous, Tanaka-san. 3 months salary, continued health benefits through the end of the year, and will provide positive references for your job search. 3 months salary for 3 decades of building the systems they would continue to profit from." I thought of the blockchain framework that had won them the government contract, the infrastructure that would generate hundreds of millions of yen in revenue, the innovations that bore my creative fingerprints but would now be credited to others. "The framework," I said quietly. "The blockchain architecture that won the contract. I developed that." Hiroshi's expression didn't change. "All intellectual property developed by employees belongs to the company, of course. That's standard in any employment agreement. Your contributions will be acknowledged appropriately. Not credited, not recognized, not compensated. Acknowledged, like a footnote in someone else's success story. Will need your company devices, access cards, and any proprietary materials," the HR representative continued, with practiced efficiency. "Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings, and we ask that you complete the exit interview process within the next hour. Security escort. After 30 years of trusted service, they would walk me out like a potential thief. I signed the documents because what else could I do? File a lawsuit I couldn't afford against a company with unlimited legal resources? Fight a battle that would destroy my reputation in an industry where word travels fast? At 52, with my entire career invested in a single company, I had no leverage and no alternatives. The walk to my office was a blur of familiar faces carefully avoiding eye contact. Word travels fast in corporate environments. And by the time I reached my desk, everyone knew. The colleagues I had mentored, the projects I had led, the systems I had built, all of it would continue without me, as if 3 decades of contribution could be erased with a restructuring notice. My personal belongings fit into a single cardboard box. 30 years reduced to a few photographs, a coffee mug from a long-ago company retreat, and a small cactus that had somehow survived on my windowsill through countless late nights and weekend debugging sessions. Everything else, every project, file, every technical document, every piece of code, belonged to them. As the security guard waited patiently beside my desk, I took one last look at the screens displaying systems I had designed, monitoring dashboards for infrastructure I had, architected status reports for networks I had secured. In a few hours, my access would be revoked, my accounts deactivated, my digital presence in the company completely erased. But they had made one crucial mistake. In their eagerness to eliminate the legacy employee, they had forgotten that legacy. Systems often have legacy vulnerabilities, and I had built every single one of their critical systems. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt eternal. Through the glass walls, I could see the conference room where Hiroshi was already meeting, with the team that would implement my blockchain framework for the government contract. They were celebrating, laughing, planning their bright future built on the foundation of my discarded expertise. At the reception desk, I handed over my access card to the security guard, the same card that had granted me entry to this building. For 30 years, that had opened doors to server rooms and executive floors, that had been the physical symbol of my belonging to this corporate family. "Tanaka-san," the young receptionist said softly, as I walked toward the exit. "Thank you for everything. We'll miss you." I nodded, not trusting my voice to respond. As the revolving door carried me out into the Tokyo morning, I looked back through the glass lobby at the company that had been my entire adult life. Employees hurried past with their laptops and coffee cups, already absorbed in the day's urgent priorities. The machine would continue running smoothly without me, processing contracts and generating profits from innovations they would never remember I had created. But they would remember me soon enough, because while they had eliminated the employee, they had left the systems intact, and those systems still recognized their true architect. The elevator descended 40 floors in silence, each floor marking another layer of my life being stripped away. By the time I reached the ground floor, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so pure and focused it felt like electricity in my veins. The severance package clutched in my other hand felt like an insult, written in legal language. $3.6 million for 30 years of service, barely enough to cover 6 months of my Tokyo rent. I sat in the lobby cafe across from the Nippon DataTech building, nursing a coffee that had gone cold while I stared at the numbers on the severance agreement. 3 months' salary, health benefits through December, a form letter of recommendation that would damn me with faint praise about my traditional strengths and historical contributions. The mathematics of betrayal were stark and undeniable. My blockchain framework would generate at least $2.8 billion in revenue over the contract's 5-year term. The licensing deals for similar government implementations across Asia could easily double that figure. Conservative estimates suggested my intellectual property would produce over $6 billion in value for the company, and my compensation for creating this treasure trove was the equivalent of a mid-level manager's quarterly bonus. Through the cafe window, I watched employees streaming into the building that had been my second home for 3 decades. Young faces, expensive suits, the confident stride of people who believed their success was inevitable. They would build their careers on the foundation I had laid, profit from innovations I had created, and never spare a thought for the legacy employee who had made their bright future possible. But as I sat there, something shifted inside me. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold clarity that I hadn't felt in years. For 30 years, I had been Sarah, the loyal employee. Sarah, the team player. Sarah, the quiet professional who never caused trouble. That person was gone, terminated along with my position. What remained was Sarah, the systems architect. Sarah, the cybersecurity expert. Sarah, the creator of digital infrastructure that these corporate children couldn't begin to comprehend. I opened my laptop, my personal laptop, not the company device they had confiscated, and began to take inventory. Every system I had built, every protocol I had designed, every security framework I had implemented. They thought they owned my work, but they had forgotten a fundamental truth about complex systems. They are only as secure as their creator intends them to be. The failsafes I had embedded over the years suddenly took on new significance. What I had told myself were responsible administrative protocols now revealed themselves as instruments of justice. Every backdoor, every override, every hidden access point was a loaded gun pointed at the heart of their digital empire. I pulled up the technical documentation for the blockchain framework, stored safely on my personal cloud storage. 847 pages of specifications, architectural diagrams, and implementation guides that represented 2 years of unpaid overtime. They had the source code, yes, but they didn't understand it. Not really. They saw the surface functionality but missed the deeper architecture, the elegant interdependencies that made the system work. More importantly, they didn't know about the conditional triggers I had embedded throughout the codebase, dormant functions that would activate under specific circumstances, like the revocation of my system access. What I had originally designed as security measures could easily become weapons of precision destruction. The irony was perfect. They had terminated me to eliminate legacy system dependencies, but their entire digital infrastructure was built on legacy systems I had created. They wanted to modernize by removing the architect, but the architecture itself was permanently marked with my digital DNA. I thought about Hiroshi's smug confidence, his casual dismissal of 3 decades of expertise, his assumption that experience was just expensive baggage. Let him try to implement the government contract without understanding the underlying systems. Let his team of consultants and recent graduates attempt to debug code they couldn't even read properly. But passive satisfaction wouldn't be enough. They had stolen my life's work, discarded my loyalty, and reduced my professional legacy to a line item in a cost-cutting spreadsheet. They deserved more than failure. They deserved to understand exactly what they had thrown away. The plan began to form with the same methodical precision I had always applied to systems architecture. Not destruction for its own sake, but surgical. Intervention designed to expose the fragility of their arrogance. They would learn that some legacy systems have very long memories, and that dismissing your system architect is like firing your pilot mid-flight. I finished my cold coffee and walked back into the Tokyo afternoon, my cardboard box of personal belongings tucked under my arm. To anyone watching, I looked like just another displaced corporate casualty, shuffling home to contemplate an uncertain future. They had no idea they had just created their own worst nightmare. My apartment in Shibuya felt different that night. Smaller, somehow, as if losing my corporate identity had physically diminished the space I was allowed to occupy in the world. But as I set up my personal laptop on the kitchen table and connected to my home network, I felt a familiar surge of power. This was my domain now, free from corporate oversight and HR policies. Here, I could work without interference or judgment. The laptop itself was unremarkable, a 3-year-old ThinkPad that I'd used for personal projects and continuing education. But what made it special was what it contained. Administrative credentials for every major system at Nippon DataTech, carefully maintained and updated through years of legitimate maintenance work. They had confiscated my company devices and deactivated my official accounts, but they hadn't thought to revoke access granted to systems I had built before such bureaucratic oversight existed. I started with reconnaissance, methodically mapping the current state of their digital infrastructure. The network topology I had designed years ago was still intact, but layered with new components I needed to understand: cloud services, third-party integrations, monitoring systems that hadn't existed when I first architected their security protocols. Modern complexity built on top of legacy foundations. Exactly the kind of hybrid environment where small changes could have massive cascading effects. The blockchain framework was running in a staging environment, being prepared for the government. Implementation. I could see the modifications Hiroshi's team had made, crude patches and inefficient workarounds that demonstrated their fundamental misunderstanding of the underlying architecture. They had managed to make my elegant code functional, but just barely. It was like watching someone perform surgery with garden tools, but their incompetence worked in my favor. The deeper administrative protocols I had embedded were still intact, hidden beneath layers of their modifications like archaeological artifacts. Access points that existed before their security audits, administrative overrides that predated their permission systems, monitoring capabilities that operated below their detection threshold. I began with the most basic preparation: documentation. Everything I was about to do needed to be precisely planned and thoroughly understood. I created flowcharts showing system dependencies, timing diagrams showing when various processes would trigger, and failure trees showing how problems would propagate through interconnected systems. This wasn't about causing random chaos. This was about surgical precision. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Instead of attacking from the outside like a traditional hacker, I would trigger failures from within using legitimate system functions. Every action would appear to be the result of normal operations, bugs in complex code, or the inevitable friction that occurs when legacy systems interact with modern components. To anyone investigating afterward, it would look like catastrophic but explainable technical failure. The key was the blockchain framework itself. Hiroshi's team had accelerated the implementation timeline to impress their government clients. which meant they were running the system at the edge of stability. My dormant failsafes were designed to activate when specific conditions were met, like the revocation of my administrative access, which had occurred exactly 71 hours and 14 minutes ago. I refined the trigger mechanism, ensuring it would activate precisely 72 hours after my termination. The symbolism pleased me. 3 days, like a technological resurrection. But more practically, it gave me time to prepare, plan, and position myself safely away from any potential legal consequences. The cascade sequence was elegantly designed. It would begin with seemingly minor errors in the blockchain consensus protocol, transactions taking slightly longer to verify, occasional timeout errors that could be attributed to network latency. Then, authentication services would begin experiencing intermittent failures, just frequent enough to be annoying, but not consistent enough to trigger immediate investigation. From there, the failures would spread through interconnected systems like a digital plague. Database connections would become unstable, API calls would fail with cryptic error messages, and backup systems would discover that their restoration procedures contained subtle flaws that had never been tested under real-world conditions. The final stage would be spectacular, a complete failure of the blockchain framework, during what I knew would be a critical demonstration for government stakeholders. Not just a simple crash, but a systematic revelation of every shortcut, every poor decision, every fundamental misunderstanding that Hiroshi's team had introduced into my original design. As I worked through the night, refining code and testing scenarios, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in years. This was engineering at its purest, identifying problems, developing solutions, implementing changes with precision and elegance. The fact that the problem I was solving was corporate betrayal, and the solution was systematic revenge didn't diminish the technical artistry involved. By dawn, everything was ready. The modified code was deployed, the trigger conditions were set, and the countdown had begun. In less than 24 hours, Nippon DataTech would discover that some legacy systems are more resilient than their creators, and that discarding your system architect comes with unexpected costs. I closed my laptop and made coffee, as the Tokyo sunrise painted my apartment in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere across the city, Hiroshi was probably arriving at the office, confident in his technological transformation, unaware that his digital empire was about to crumble from within. They had taught me that loyalty was worthless in the modern corporate world. Now I would teach them that expertise, once betrayed, becomes the most dangerous force in any system. The system monitoring dashboard glowed like a constellation of green lights across multiple screens in Nippon DataTech's Network Operations Center. Every metric showed optimal performance, CPU utilization within normal parameters, network latency minimal, database queries executing smoothly. The blockchain framework was humming along in staging mode, processing test transactions with the kind of reliability that made system administrators sleep peacefully at night. If only they knew what I knew. I sat in a cafe in Harajuku, my laptop, displaying the same monitoring data they were seeing in their corporate tower. The beautiful irony was that I had better visibility into their systems than they did. My administrative access included monitoring capabilities that existed below their standard dashboards, legacy protocols that reported directly to endpoints they didn't even know existed. 23 hours and 47 minutes until activation. The countdown had become a physical presence in my chest, a drumbeat that synchronized with my heartbeat. I found myself checking the time obsessively, calculating and recalculating exactly when the first failures would begin to manifest. Part of me, the part that had been loyal for 30 years, whispered that I should call it off. Send a warning email, claim I had discovered a critical vulnerability, gracefully return to save the company that had discarded me. But that voice was growing weaker by the hour, overwhelmed by the memory of Hiroshi's casual dismissal and the insulting severance package that had valued 3 decades of expertise at less than a mid-level manager's bonus. The morning news carried a story about Nippon DataTech's government contract victory. Hiroshi was interviewed, standing confidently in front of the company logo, explaining how their innovative blockchain solution would revolutionize Japanese public services. He spoke about cutting-edge technology and revolutionary approaches, without once mentioning the person who had actually created the framework that made his promises possible. We're not just implementing existing technology, Hiroshi told the reporter, with the kind of smooth confidence that comes from believing your own marketing. We're pioneering the future of digital governance, This project represents everything modern technology companies should aspire to achieve. Everything modern technology companies should aspire to achieve. Built on the foundation of stolen work and discarded loyalty. I watched the interview on my phone, studying Hiroshi's face as he described technical capabilities he didn't truly understand. There was no malice in his expression, no conscious cruelty, just the casual indifference of someone who had never considered that his success might be built on someone else's sacrifice. That somehow made it worse. The government demonstration was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, exactly 4 hours after my failsafe would activate. Perfect timing. They would gather their most important stakeholders, prepare their most impressive presentation, and then watch their digital empire collapse in real time while trying to explain to confused bureaucrats why their revolutionary technology had suddenly forgotten how to function. My phone buzzed with a text message from Nakamura-san, the database architect who had taken early retirement rather than endure Hiroshi's modernization program. Saw the news about the big contract. Congratulations. Your framework finally getting the recognition it deserves. If only he knew how right he was. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. I walked through Shibuya, past the building, where I had spent 30 years of my life, looking up at the windows of offices where my former colleagues were preparing for what they thought would be their greatest triumph. Some of them were good people who didn't deserve what was coming, but they had chosen silence when I was eliminated, complicity when they could have shown solidarity. As evening approached, I returned to my apartment and opened my laptop one final time. The monitoring dashboard still showed perfect green lights, systems humming along without any indication of the storm that was building in their digital DNA. In less than 12 hours, those green lights would turn red, and the cascade of failures would begin. I had one last chance to stop it, one final opportunity to choose mercy over justice, forgiveness over revenge. The abort codes were still in my system, waiting for a command that would deactivate the failsafe and preserve the infrastructure I had spent my career building. But then, I remembered the look in Hiroshi's eyes when he handed me that termination notice. The casual dismissal of 30 years of service, the theft of my intellectual property and the erasure of my contributions, the assumption that loyalty was a weakness to be exploited rather than a strength to be honored. I closed my laptop without entering the abort codes. The countdown continued, inexorable as gravity. In a few hours, Nippon DataTech would learn that some legacy systems have very long memories, and that the architect they had discarded so casually had built more than they realized into the foundation of their digital empire. They wanted modernization. They were about to discover that the most dangerous failures are the ones that come from within. The error log appeared at exactly 9:47 a.m., 72 hours to the minute after my termination. A single line in a system log that no one was actively monitoring. Consensus protocol timeout. Retrying verification sequence. Innocuous. Routine. The kind of minor hiccup that happens a dozen times a day in complex systems. The first domino in a chain reaction that would bring down a Y6 billion corporation within hours. I was sitting in the same cafe across from their building, watching the drama unfold through my administrative access to their monitoring systems. The beauty of my approach was its subtlety. Each failure appeared to be a natural consequence of the previous one, a cascading series of unfortunate events rather than a coordinated attack. The blockchain framework began exhibiting the first symptoms at 10:15 a.m. Transaction verification times increased from milliseconds to seconds, then to minutes. The monitoring dashboard showed yellow warnings as the system struggled to maintain consensus across distributed nodes. In the network operations center, I imagined technicians frowning at their screens, running diagnostic routines that would find nothing obviously wrong. By 10:30, the authentication services joined the chaos. Login failures spiked as the framework's security protocols began rejecting valid credentials. User accounts were locked out seemingly at random, database connections timed out with cryptic error messages, and API calls returned responses that were technically correct, but functionally useless. The morning's first crisis meeting was called at 10:45. Through the building's glass walls, I could see figures gathering in conference rooms, their body language shifting from puzzlement to concern, to the kind of controlled panic that characterizes technology disasters. Hiroshi was moving between rooms, his usual confidence replaced by the jerky movements of someone trying to manage multiple emergencies simultaneously. At 11:00 a.m., the backup systems discovered their fatal flaw. When the primary blockchain nodes began failing, automated recovery procedures attempted to restore service from redundant hardware. But the backup configurations contained subtle errors, modifications I had embedded years ago during routine maintenance, designed to look like typos but actually representing logical inconsistencies that would only manifest under specific failure conditions. The backup systems failed more spectacularly than the primary ones. Instead of graceful degradation, they experienced what appeared to be catastrophic hardware failures. Disk arrays reported corruption in critical system files, network interfaces, experienced mysterious packet loss, and database restoration procedures discovered that their backup files contained checksums that no longer matched the data they were supposed to protect. By 11:30, their entire digital infrastructure was in freefall. The blockchain framework had stopped processing transactions entirely. Authentication services were completely offline, and even basic functions like email and internal communications were experiencing intermittent failures. What had started as minor performance issues had metastasized into systematic collapse. I watched through my laptop as technicians ran increasingly desperate diagnostic procedures. They were following troubleshooting protocols I had written, using tools I had configured, trying to debug systems I had designed. But the failures were occurring at architectural levels they couldn't access, embedded in foundational code they didn't fully understand. The government demonstration was scheduled for 2 p.m. At noon, I could see the frantic activity in their offices reaching fever pitch. External consultants were being called in, emergency service vendors were being contacted, and someone was probably explaining to very important government officials that there might be a slight delay in the presentation. At 12:30, they made their first critical mistake. Instead of shutting down the failing systems to prevent further damage, they decided to attempt a live repair during the government presentation. The logic was understandable. They couldn't afford to cancel the most important meeting in company history, so they would fix the problems while demonstrating the system's resilience. I had counted on exactly this kind of corporate hubris. The government officials arrived at 1:45 p.m. Senior bureaucrats, technology advisors, and ministry representatives, who controlled budgets worth billions of yen. I could see them entering the building through the cafe window, dressed in their formal dark suits, carrying briefcases full of contracts and expectations. At exactly 2:09 p.m., Hiroshi began his presentation in the 40th floor conference room. I couldn't see the meeting itself, but I could monitor the system activity as he attempted to demonstrate the blockchain framework's capabilities. Database queries were initiated, transaction processing was attempted, and authentication sequences were triggered. And then, in perfect synchronization, everything failed at once. The blockchain framework didn't just crash, it disintegrated. Transaction records became corrupted. Consensus protocols reported impossible states, and security certificates were rejected by the very systems that had issued them. The demonstration screens went dark. Error messages cascaded across multiple displays, and 30 years of digital infrastructure collapsed like a house of cards. Through my administrative access, I watched the final act of systematic destruction. Database servers reported critical errors, network equipment lost connectivity to essential services, and backup systems discovered that their emergency procedures required access to the primary systems that were no longer functional. At 2:47 p.m., exactly 73 hours after my termination, Nippon DataTech's digital empire went completely dark. Every system I had built over 3 decades had simultaneously discovered that it was no longer willing to function for the people who had discarded its creator. The government officials left the building 20 minutes later, their faces grim, with the kind of disappointment that ends careers and cancels contracts. The forensic analysis report arrived 3 days after the crash, delivered by a team of cybersecurity experts who had worked around the clock to understand what had destroyed Nippon DataTech's digital infrastructure. The document was thorough, technical, and absolutely damning in its conclusions. The failures were not accidental, but rather the result of sophisticated code embedded deep within the system architecture. I read the leaked report from the comfort of my apartment, downloaded from a file-sharing site where a disgruntled employee had posted it along with other internal documents. The investigators had done excellent work, tracing the cascade of failures back to their source with the kind of methodical precision I admired. They had found my fingerprints all over the crime scene, but understanding what those fingerprints meant was another matter entirely. The embedded code demonstrates intimate knowledge of system architecture dating back multiple years, the report stated. The sophistication of the implementation suggests someone with administrative access to core infrastructure and deep understanding of interdependencies between critical systems. This was not an external attack, but rather a coordinated sabotage. Operation executed by someone with legitimate access credentials. Legitimate access credentials. Even in their investigation, they couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge that those credentials were legitimate, because I had built the systems they were analyzing. The code they had discovered wasn't malicious software planted by an outsider. It was security infrastructure I had implemented as part of my responsibilities as senior systems architect. The technical analysis was fascinating to read. They had identified the trigger mechanisms, mapped the failure propagation paths, and even discovered some of the more elegant aspects of my architectural choices. But they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what they were investigating. They saw evidence of sabotage where I had implemented security protocols, found malicious intent in administrative tools, and attributed to revenge what had originally been designed as protective measures. The report's conclusions were inevitable. Investigation focuses on recently terminated employees with appropriate technical expertise and access to critical systems. Primary suspect, Sarah Tanaka, senior systems architect, terminated 3 days prior to system failure activation. Within hours of the report's completion, I received visitors. The 2 police officers who knocked on my apartment door were polite, professional, and clearly uncomfortable with the technical nature of their investigation. Detective Yamamoto, no relation to Hiroshi, thankfully, was a veteran investigator who specialized in corporate crime, while Detective Sato was younger, more familiar with cybersecurity issues, but still clearly out of her depth when dealing with blockchain architectures and distributed systems. Tanaka-san, Detective Yamamoto began as we sat in my small living room. We're investigating the system failures at Nippon DataTech Corporation. We understand you were recently terminated from your position there. That's correct, I replied, maintaining the calm demeanor I had practiced for this exact scenario. I was let go due to corporate restructuring. Very unfortunate, but these things happen in the modern economy. Detective Sato leaned forward, her notebook ready. Can you tell us about your responsibilities at the company? Specifically, your access to critical systems. I was the senior systems architect, I explained patiently. My job was to design, implement, and maintain the digital infrastructure that supported company operations. That required administrative access to most systems. Yes, but always within appropriate security protocols and corporate oversight. The forensic analysis suggests that someone with your level of access could have embedded code designed to cause systematic failures, Detective Yamamoto said, watching my reaction carefully. Do you have any knowledge of such code? This was the crucial moment, the fulcrum on which everything balanced. I looked directly at Detective Yamamoto, my expression reflecting nothing but professional concern. Detective, any experienced systems architect implements security protocols and administrative tools as part of their standard responsibilities. Emergency access procedures, diagnostic routines, system monitoring capabilities. These are normal features of any robust infrastructure. If someone is interpreting legitimate security measures as malicious code, that suggests they don't understand the systems they're analyzing. It was technically true, which made it the perfect response. The code they had discovered was indeed security infrastructure I had implemented as part of my job. The fact that I had later modified the trigger conditions to serve a different purpose was a subtle distinction that would be nearly impossible to prove in court. Detective Sato consulted her notes. The timing of the failures, exactly 72 hours after your termination, seems highly coincidental. I nodded thoughtfully. It does seem suspicious, doesn't it? But consider the alternative explanation. I had been maintaining those systems for 30 years. My termination meant that critical maintenance procedures were no longer being performed. Complex systems often fail when their primary administrator is suddenly removed, especially if the replacement team doesn't fully understand the underlying architecture. You're suggesting the failures were caused by lack of maintenance rather than deliberate sabotage? Detective Yamamoto asked. I'm suggesting that correlation doesn't imply causation, I replied. The timing is certainly unfortunate, but systematic. Failures often occur when experienced personnel are eliminated during corporate restructuring. It's actually quite common in the technology industry. The questioning continued for 2 hours, covering technical details, timeline analysis, and motive assessment. The detectives were thorough but handicapped by their limited understanding of the systems involved. They knew something suspicious had occurred, but proving intentional sabotage required demonstrating malicious intent, and I had been very careful to ensure that every action I had taken could be interpreted as legitimate. System administration. When they finally left, I felt cautiously optimistic. The investigation would continue, but without concrete evidence of deliberate sabotage, it would be difficult to build a criminal case. The embedded code could be explained as security infrastructure. The timing could be attributed to coincidence, and my motive, while obvious, wasn't sufficient for prosecution without supporting evidence. More importantly, I knew that Nippon DataTech faced a choice: pursue a lengthy legal battle that would further damage their reputation and reveal the extent of their technical incompetence, or quietly resolve the matter and focus on rebuilding their shattered business. Given the pragmatic nature of Japanese corporate culture, I was confident they would choose the path that minimized further embarrassment. The police warrant was formal, official, and surprisingly narrow in its scope. Detective Yamamoto returned to my apartment 1 week after our initial conversation, this time with a legal document authorizing my questioning about suspected corporate sabotage and unauthorized access to computer systems. But as I read the warrant carefully, I noticed what wasn't included. No search authorization, no seizure of electronic devices, no arrest powers beyond standard questioning. They had a theory, but lacked evidence. More importantly, they were constrained by the same corporate politics that had created this situation in the first place. Tanaka-san, Detective Yamamoto began as we settled into my living room once again. We've completed our preliminary investigation into the Nippon DataTech system failures. The evidence strongly suggests deliberate sabotage executed by someone with intimate knowledge of their infrastructure. I nodded thoughtfully, projecting the calm concern of someone eager to help solve a serious crime. That's very troubling. Detective, corporate sabotage is a serious matter. How can I assist your investigation? Detective Sato opened her tablet, displaying what I recognized as network topology diagrams from my own documentation. These systems were designed with multiple administrative access points, many of which weren't documented in standard security protocols. Only someone with your level of involvement would know about these hidden access methods. I wouldn't call them hidden, I replied carefully. Emergency access protocols are standard practice in any robust system architecture. During my 30 years at the company, I implemented many such protocols as part of my security responsibilities. All of this was done with appropriate oversight and documentation. But these protocols were designed to activate under very specific conditions, Detective Yamamoto pressed. Conditions that occurred exactly 72 hours after your termination. This was the moment I had prepared for. The crucial exchange that would determine whether I faced criminal charges or walked away free. I leaned forward slightly, adopting the patient tone of a technical expert, explaining complex concepts to well-meaning but uninformed investigators. Detective, let me explain how enterprise systems actually work. When you remove a senior administrator from complex infrastructure, especially someone who has been maintaining those systems for decades, you create what we call maintenance debt. Critical procedures stop being performed, monitoring protocols lose their oversight, and automated systems begin experiencing failures that were previously prevented by human intervention. I pulled out my laptop and opened a presentation I had prepared specifically for this conversation. The timing you're questioning, 72 hours, is actually quite predictable. Most enterprise systems have built-in grace periods for exactly this kind of transition. Cache expiration cycles, authentication token lifetimes, automated maintenance schedules. These all operate on standard intervals that cluster around the 72-hour mark. Detective Sato studied the technical diagrams I was showing them. You're saying the failures were caused by normal system processes rather than deliberate sabotage? I'm saying that correlation doesn't prove causation, I replied. Yes, the timing appears suspicious, but the alternative explanation, that complex systems failed when their primary maintainer was suddenly removed, is not only plausible but predictable. Any experienced systems administrator could have warned them this might happen. Detective Yamamoto consulted his notes. The forensic analysis identified code that seemed designed to cause cascading failures. How do you explain that? I had anticipated this question and prepared my most technical response. What they're identifying as malicious code is actually defensive programming, error handling routines designed to prevent data corruption during system failures. When primary processes begin failing, these routines initiate controlled shutdowns to protect data integrity. The alternative would be catastrophic data loss. So you're saying the systems shut themselves down to prevent worse damage? Detective Sato asked. Exactly. It's called failsafe design. When something goes wrong, the system defaults to the safest possible state, which is usually complete shutdown, rather than continued operation with corrupted data. What the forensic team interpreted as sabotage were actually protection mechanisms doing exactly what they were designed to do. The questioning continued for another hour, but I could see the detectives' confidence waning. They had expected to confront a bitter ex-employee who had lashed out at their former company. Instead, they were facing a technical expert who could explain every aspect of the system failures in terms of legitimate administrative practices and predictable system behavior. More crucially, they were beginning to understand the legal complications of their investigation. Proving malicious intent would require demonstrating that legitimate security protocols had been deliberately modified for destructive purposes, but the modifications I had made were subtle enough to be interpreted as normal maintenance activities, and the destructive effects could be explained as unintended consequences of system complexity. When Detective Yamamoto finally closed his notebook, his expression was that of someone who understood they were facing an unwinnable case. "Tanaka-san, we may have additional questions as our investigation continues. Please remain available for further consultation." "Of course, Detective. I want to see this matter resolved as much as anyone. Corporate sabotage is a serious crime that damages trust in our technology industry." After they left, I sat quietly in my apartment, processing what had just occurred. The investigation would continue, but I was confident it would eventually be closed without charges. The technical evidence could be explained away. The circumstantial evidence wasn't sufficient for prosecution. And most importantly, Nippon DataTech was probably more interested in rebuilding their business than pursuing a lengthy legal battle that would keep their humiliation in the public eye. I had successfully navigated the most dangerous phase of my revenge. The system had crashed exactly as planned. The investigation had found no prosecutable evidence, and I was free to move forward with my life while they struggled to rebuild from the wreckage of their digital empire. Justice, it seemed sometimes, wore the mask of plausible deniability. The Nikkei Business News article appeared on page 1, with the kind of headline that ends careers. Tech giant's Y6 billion government contract collapses in spectacular system failure. The photograph accompanying the story showed the Nippon DataTech building in Shibuya, its normally bustling lobby empty except for security guards and a few employees carrying cardboard boxes, the universal symbol of corporate catastrophe. I read the article over coffee in the same cafe where I had planned my revenge, savoring every devastating detail. The failure occurred during a live demonstration for government officials, with critical systems experiencing what experts describe as cascading infrastructure collapse. The company's blockchain framework, touted as revolutionary technology, completely disintegrated within minutes of activation. The financial numbers were even more satisfying than I had anticipated. The canceled government contract alone represented $2.8 billion in lost revenue. But the secondary effects were far more damaging. Investor confidence had evaporated, wiping out $4.2 billion in market capitalization within a week. Credit ratings had been downgraded, making future financing prohibitively expensive. Insurance claims were being disputed. Vendor relationships had been terminated, and prospective clients were canceling negotiations rather than risk association with technological failure on such a spectacular scale. But the human cost was the most telling indicator of how completely my revenge had succeeded. The article included a sidebar listing executive departures. Hiroshi Yamamoto had resigned to pursue other opportunities, along with 6 other senior managers who had been involved in my termination and the botched system implementation. The consulting team that had recommended my elimination had been dismissed, their contract terminated for failure to deliver promised organizational improvements. The irony was perfect. They had fired me to reduce costs and improve efficiency. But my removal had triggered expenses that dwarfed my annual salary by several orders of magnitude. The legacy employee they had considered a burden had turned out to be the keystone holding their entire digital architecture together. I followed the coverage obsessively over the following weeks. Trade publications dissected the technical failures with the kind of detailed analysis that made me proud of my engineering work, even as they speculated about causes and prevention strategies. Business journals examined the corporate governance failures that had led to such catastrophic decision-making. Technology blogs turned Nippon DataTech into a cautionary tale about the dangers of dismissing experienced personnel during digital transformation initiatives. The coverage was uniformly damaging, But what pleased me most was how it implicitly vindicated my expertise. Every technical analysis confirmed that the systems had been well designed originally, that the failures had occurred due to modifications and maintenance issues that arose after my departure. Without ever mentioning my name, the articles painted a clear picture. This disaster could have been prevented if the company had retained and respected its experienced technical staff. 3 weeks after the crash, I received an unexpected phone call from Nakamura-san, my former colleague who had taken early retirement rather than endure Hiroshi's modernization program. His voice carried a mixture of amazement and dark satisfaction. "Sarah-chan, have you been following the news about the company?" he asked, using the affectionate suffix that reminded me of better times. "It's been hard to avoid," I replied carefully. "Very unfortunate situation." "Unfortunate?" He laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from him in years. "It's poetic justice. You know they've had to bring back half the people they forced out? Matsuda-san from network operations, Kimura-san from database administration, even old Watanabe-san who retired 2 years ago. They're paying consulting rates that are 3 times what those people made as employees." The news was even better than I had hoped. Not only had my revenge succeeded in destroying their arrogant new regime, but it had created opportunities for the colleagues who had been discarded along with me. The company was having to rebuild its technical capabilities from scratch, and the only people with the necessary expertise were the legacy employees they had so casually dismissed. "They're calling it a knowledge recovery initiative," Nakamura-san continued with obvious amusement, "bringing back institutional memory and critical expertise. The new management team is very concerned about maintaining operational continuity and respecting technical heritage. Corporate speak for admitting they had made a catastrophic mistake in eliminating experienced personnel. The final piece of news came a month later, buried in the business section of a smaller financial publication. Nippon DataTech had been acquired by a larger technology firm at a fraction of its previous valuation. The acquisition was described as a strategic consolidation to leverage existing infrastructure and technical capabilities, but I understood the real translation. They were being sold for parts, their intellectual property and client relationships absorbed by a competitor who could properly manage what they had so spectacularly mishandled. Hiroshi Yamamoto's career had effectively ended at age 25. His LinkedIn profile, which I checked periodically out of professional curiosity, showed increasingly desperate attempts to rebrand the disaster as valuable learning experience and leadership under challenging circumstances. But the technology industry has a long memory for failures of this magnitude, and his association with the Nippon DataTech collapse would follow him for the rest of his career. The consulting firm that had recommended my elimination faced their own consequences. Several government contracts were canceled after questions arose about their competence and judgment. Their human resource optimization methodology, once considered cutting edge, was now viewed as a cautionary example of the dangers of prioritizing cost reduction over institutional knowledge. As I read these updates, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond simple revenge. This wasn't just about punishing the people who had wronged me. It was about proving a fundamental point about the value of experience, loyalty, and technical expertise in an industry that had become obsessed with youth, disruption, and superficial innovation. They had treated me as disposable, but they had discovered that some systems are more resilient than their creators, and some knowledge cannot be easily replaced. The 30 years I had spent building their digital empire hadn't just been eliminated with a termination notice. It had been woven into the very foundation of everything they did. When they tried to discard the architect, the architecture itself had reminded them why experience matters. The settlement agreement arrived by courier on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 months after the system crash that had brought down Nippon DataTech. The document was thick, formal, and bound in the kind of expensive legal presentation that corporations use when they want to appear both generous and intimidating. But as I read through the carefully crafted language, I realized they were essentially surrendering. Mutual resolution of all claims and counterclaims arising from employment termination and subsequent system failures. The agreement stated in the bloodless prose of corporate lawyers. Translation: they couldn't prove I had sabotaged their systems, but they suspected it strongly enough to pay handsomely for my silence. The financial terms were extraordinary. $50 million in immediate settlement, another $30 million in structured payments over 3 years, full healthcare coverage for 5 years, and a pension enhancement that effectively doubled my retirement. Benefits, more than 20 times what they had originally offered in severance, enough to buy a comfortable house and live independently for the rest of my life. But the most satisfying clause was buried in the technical language about intellectual property rights. They were granting me co-inventor status on the blockchain framework patents, ensuring that my name would be permanently associated with the technology I had created. After trying to erase my contributions, they were now legally acknowledging my expertise and innovation. The non-disclosure agreement was mutual and comprehensive. Neither party could discuss the circumstances surrounding my termination, the system failures, or the investigation that followed. They couldn't publicly blame me for their disaster, and I couldn't publicly claim credit for my revenge. It was a Cold War détente written in legal language, ensuring that the truth would remain buried in confidential documents and sealed court records. I signed the agreement without hesitation. This wasn't just about money, it was about recognition. After 30 years of service and months of being treated as a disposable resource, they were finally acknowledging my value in the most concrete way possible, by paying what I was actually worth. The signing ceremony took place in a neutral conference room at my lawyer's office. Takeshi Matsumoto, son of the company's founder, attended personally rather than sending subordinates. He looked older than his years, worn down by months of crisis management and public humiliation. When he shook my hand after the documents were executed, there was something like respect in his eyes, the grudging acknowledgement of someone who had been thoroughly outmaneuvered. "Tanaka-san," he said quietly as we prepared to leave, "I hope you understand that the decision to terminate your employment was not personal. It was purely a business decision." I looked at him steadily, this man who had inherited his father's company, but not his wisdom about the value of loyalty and institutional knowledge. "Matsumoto-san," I replied, "I hope you understand that what happened afterward was also purely a business decision." He nodded slowly, perhaps finally comprehending the lesson I had taught at such enormous expense to his company. In the modern corporate world, employees were disposable resources, but expertise, once betrayed, could become the most dangerous force in any organization. 6 months after the settlement, I stood in the lobby of a gleaming office building in Roppongi, studying the directory that listed my company among the other professional services firms: Tanaka Cybersecurity Consulting, Digital Infrastructure Specialists. The business license framed on my reception desk was more than just regulatory paperwork. It was a declaration of independence from the corporate structures that had once defined my entire identity. Starting my own consulting firm had been both liberating and terrifying. After 30 years of corporate employment, the transition to entrepreneurship required learning entirely new skills: business development, contract negotiation, marketing, financial management. But the technical expertise that had made me valuable as an employee made me indispensable as a consultant. My first client was ironic in its appropriateness: a government ministry that needed help evaluating blockchain proposals from technology vendors. The officials who hired me had no idea about my connection to the Nippon DataTech disaster, but they had heard about my expertise through industry networks and wanted someone with deep knowledge of distributed systems security. The consultation revealed how badly other vendors misunderstood the technical requirements. Their proposals were filled with the same superficial buzzword compliance and architectural shortcuts that had characterized Hiroshi's approach. I found myself in the satisfying position of protecting the government from the kind of technological snake oil that had contributed to my former company's downfall. Word spread quickly through Tokyo's technology community. A consultant who could actually deliver on the promises other firms only made in PowerPoint presentations was a rare commodity. My client base expanded to include financial institutions, healthcare organizations, and manufacturing companies, all seeking expertise in the kind of robust, secure infrastructure that had become my specialty. The respect I received as an independent consultant was everything I had been denied as a corporate employee. Clients listened to my recommendations because they were paying for my expertise, not because organizational charts said they should. Technical discussions focused on problem solving rather than politics. My age and experience were assets rather than liabilities, evidence of deep knowledge rather than resistance to change. But the most rewarding aspect of my new career was mentoring younger engineers who sought my guidance. The technology industry's obsession with youth had left many talented professionals without access to the kind of institutional knowledge that only comes from decades of experience. I found myself serving as both technical consultant and career advisor, helping them navigate challenges that I had faced myself. Tanaka-sensei, one young programmer said after a training session on secure coding practices. How do you maintain such deep expertise across so many different technologies? Curiosity and humility, I replied, using the honorific that still felt strange but gratifying to hear. Stay curious about new developments, but humble about the complexity of systems that appear simple. Most importantly, remember that technology serves people. When you lose sight of that human element, you make decisions like the ones that destroyed Nippon DataTech. The comparison wasn't lost on my audience. The Nippon DataTech case study had become standard curriculum in business schools and technology programs, a cautionary tale about the importance of institutional knowledge and the dangers of prioritizing superficial innovation over fundamental competence. 2 years have passed since that Tuesday morning, when Hiroshi Yamamoto handed me a termination notice and inadvertently set in motion the destruction of his digital empire. I'm writing this from my home office in a quiet neighborhood near Tokyo Bay, surrounded by the professional accolades and industry recognition that finally acknowledge what I always knew about my own capabilities. The framed photograph on my desk shows my original team from 1994. 12 young engineers with boundless optimism and absolute faith in the technology we were building. Most of them have moved on to other companies or retired, but we stay in touch through occasional reunions, where we share stories about the old days, when corporate loyalty was mutual and experience was valued rather than discarded. What happened to Nippon DataTech wasn't really about revenge, though revenge was certainly part of it. It was about justice, the fundamental principle that expertise has value, that loyalty deserves respect, that 30 years of dedicated service cannot be casually dismissed with a restructuring notice and an insulting severance package. The technology industry has changed dramatically since I started my career, and not all of those changes have been positive. The emphasis on disruption over stability, youth over experience, innovation over reliability, has created a culture where institutional knowledge is seen as baggage rather than treasure. Companies routinely discard their most experienced employees in favor of cheaper, more agile alternatives, never considering that some knowledge cannot be easily transferred or replaced. My story is not unique. Across the industry, experienced professionals are being pushed aside by corporate leaders who mistake cost-cutting for efficiency, who believe that any problem can be solved by hiring more recent graduates with impressive resumes and limited real-world experience. They create systems built on foundations they don't understand, then wonder why those systems fail when the people who built them are no longer around to maintain them. But there's hope in the growing recognition that experience matters, that stability has value, that the most innovative solutions often come from deep understanding of fundamental principles, rather than superficial familiarity with the latest trends. My consulting practice thrives because clients have learned to value expertise over enthusiasm, competence over claims. The lesson I taught Nippon DataTech has broader implications for anyone working in the modern economy. Loyalty is indeed a two-way street, but it's also a strategic asset that must be protected and leveraged wisely. Companies that treat employees as disposable resources will eventually discover that some employees are more indispensable than they realized. Workers who invest their careers in single organizations must ensure they retain the independence and capabilities necessary to survive corporate betrayal. For those of you who have faced similar betrayals, and I know from the comments on this story that many of you have, remember that expertise is portable, experience is valuable, and justice sometimes requires patience and careful planning. Don't let corporate rhetoric about modernization and efficiency convince you that your knowledge is obsolete. The same systems they claim to want to replace were built by people with your skills and experience. Protect yourselves. Document your contributions. Maintain your technical capabilities. Build relationships outside your current employer. And if the day comes when they hand you a termination notice despite decades of loyal service, remember that the best revenge is not destruction for its own sake, but the kind of systematic demonstration of value that leaves no doubt about what they've lost. Like and subscribe if you've ever been betrayed by the company you gave your life to. Share your own stories in the comments below. I read every one, and your experiences help others understand they're not alone in facing these challenges. The future belongs to those who understand that true innovation comes from the marriage of experience and adaptation, that the most reliable systems are built by people who understand both their power and their responsibility. Technology should serve people, and the people who create that technology deserve respect, recognition, and reward proportional to their contributions. That's a lesson worth teaching, no matter the cost.